Hey everyone! Tonight we're slipping quietly behind the shop doors and bustling market stalls of the medieval world. Not to focus on kings or knights, but to explore the hidden stories of women who mastered trades you'd never expect. From glassblowers and net makers to blacksmiths and brewers, these women shaped daily life in ways history rarely admits. So before you settle in, take a second to like and subscribe only if you really enjoy these untold stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on some soft background sounds, and let's wander together into the secret workshops of medieval women. The tanner's widow who ran the entire leather trade in secret. Imagine yourself in a medieval town, the air tinged with the heavy scent of curing hides and wood smoke. The leather trade, though far from glamorous, was the silent backbone of much daily life, providing shoes, belts, harnesses, book bindings, and countless other necessities. At the edge of this town stands a tannery, a cluster of timber sheds, low stone vats, and tidy piles of stacked oak bark. For many years, the tannery's reputation rested on the reliability of its work, its timely deliveries, and the quiet certainty that it would endure from one season to the next. Few outsiders suspected that, at the heart of this operation, the real architect of the tannery's success was not the late master tanner, but his widow, after her husband's unexpected death. A chill caught while fishing in winter. The community assumed that his business would pass to a distant male relative or simply dissolve. Instead, the widow quietly took up the mantle. She did not announce her intentions, nor seek permission from guilds or town officials. Instead, she continued her daily routine, outwardly performing the humble tasks expected of a servant. If you picture her in those early mornings, you might see her sweeping the yard or carrying buckets to the lime pits, always in plain dress, her head covered, moving among the workers with practiced discretion. Yet beneath this modest appearance, she managed every detail of the tannery's affairs. She kept careful inventory of raw hides as they arrived from nearby farms, ordering the right quantities so that the lime pits were never left idle. She bartered with merchants, sometimes standing in the shadows while a trusted foreman negotiated, slipping him notes she had written herself. Though to the outside world, she pretended she could not read or write at all. The business of tanning was complex and harsh. Hides had to be cleaned and soaked, stripped of hair in caustic lime, then cured and kneaded in a long process that left hands chapped and eyes stinging. The lime pits, sunk deep and rimmed with slippery flagstones, needed constant tending. Bark for tanning was expensive and required timely delivery from the woodsman. Yet the widow mastered each step. She learned which hides would turn supple, which would crack, and how to judge when a vat was ready for the next stage by the feel of the air and the weight of the water drawn from the well. In dealing with buyers and guild officials, she was especially cautious. Laws and customs in many towns barred women from running such trades in their own name. But necessity, and a lifetime of learning by observation, gave her the skills to navigate this world from behind a careful veil. When merchants arrived, she kept to the background, listening to their offers and watching their gestures. If negotiations stalled, she quietly signaled her foreman, who would propose new terms in his own voice. In time, the tannery gained a reputation for shrewd but fair dealings, for fulfilling even large orders reliably. The workers, most of whom had served under her husband, quickly understood where the real decisions were made. A sideways glance or a brief word from her could change a day's work. Yet, out of loyalty or caution, they maintained the fiction that she was no more than a diligent housekeeper. This arrangement protected everyone. Her authority could not be openly challenged, but nor could it be officially acknowledged. Imagine, on a market day, the bustle of buyers crowding the stalls while she stands quietly to one side, hands folded, eyes flickering from merchant to merchant. Perhaps she murmurs a brief suggestion to the foreman, who promptly strikes a better deal. She oversees the delivery schedules, records every transaction in a hidden ledger, and pays the workers herself, always making sure that her signature never appears. The town, for the most part, preferred not to ask too many questions. The tannery's taxes were paid, its obligations met, and its products kept local cobblers, saddlers, and bookbinders supplied. Even the guild, notorious for guarding its privileges, found little cause for complaint. Occasionally, a visiting inspector might puzzle over the efficient operation run without visible leadership, but would eventually move on, finding nothing to challenge directly. Years passed in this fashion. The widow aged quietly, her hands calloused but steady, her gaze still sharp. She trained her daughter in secret, showing her how to judge hides, when to press for lower prices on bark, and how to write numbers in a private cipher. When at last she could no longer keep up with the physical demands of the work, the transition was seamless. The tannery continued to prosper, its true leadership still hidden in plain sight. Long after her passing, some workers whispered stories about her wisdom and resolve, but no records bore her name. The town's official histories listed her only as the widow of the tanner. Yet those who remembered the subtle rhythms of her daily life, the measured way she walked the yard at dawn, the surety with which she managed every difficulty, understood that, for many years, the entire leather trade had depended on her quiet skill. So, as you imagine the hush of the tannery at dusk, with the lime pits settling and the day's work done, consider the unseen hands that kept such places running. The rhythm of their lives, built on diligence, discretion, and 1,000 small decisions, remains woven through the town's prosperity, long after their names have faded from the record. The brewer who hid her ale techniques inside a church recipe book. Imagine yourself in a small medieval town, the morning sun just brushing the cobbled streets and illuminating the weathered stone of the parish church. As you pass by the market square, you might catch the faint scent of yeast and malt drifting from a nearby alley, mingling with the cool air. This is not the grand world of kings and nobles, but a quieter rhythm of daily life. Bakers setting out their loaves, weavers sweeping their stoops, and at the edge of the market, a brewer preparing her barrels for the day ahead. Her name is not recorded in the official guild rolls, nor does it appear in the ledgers kept by town magistrates. In this age, the craft of brewing is often guarded by tight circles, brewers' guilds, most of them closed to women, with rules enforced by tradition and sometimes law. For the townsfolk, however, it is her ale they remember, rich, subtly spiced, with a clarity and depth that set it apart from the usual fare. Imagine the quiet determination required to master such a craft in secret. Without access to the resources or formal apprenticeships granted to men, she learns by patient observation and careful trial. Perhaps her family brewed ale for their own table, or perhaps she gleaned fragments of technique from overheard conversations and discarded scraps of parchment. She keeps meticulous notes in a private ledger, marking down which batches turned out sour, which yielded unexpected flavors, and which seemed almost miraculous in their balance. But in time, her skill draws attention, and with it suspicion. The local guild, protective of its privileges, begins to ask questions. There are murmurs about unauthorized brewing, about women practicing trades without sanction, about secrets that ought not be shared outside proper channels. Fines are levied. Sometimes, barrels are confiscated. The threat is clear. Continue and risk not only her livelihood, but her safety and reputation as well. Faced with this, she devises a solution both subtle and enduring. The church, with its libraries and scriptoriums, is a place where manuscripts pass with little scrutiny, especially if written in Latin and purporting to be collections of psalms or prayers. She acquires a small book, its vellum pages ready for copying. In neat, careful hand, she begins to encode her brewing secrets within the familiar cadence of religious verse. Imagine the page before you, lines of Latin script, each psalm a puzzle, each prayer layered with hidden meaning. She disguises the varieties of hops as saints' names, their properties woven into passages about purity and clarity. The correct yeast strains are catalogued as holy leaven, with references to rising and dormancy tucked between lines of devotion. Fermentation times and temperatures are disguised as liturgical cycles, while notes on flavor and aroma are buried in descriptions of incense and sacred oils. Anyone skimming the book would see nothing but a devout compilation of prayers. Yet for those with the key, a knowledge of brewing, an understanding of her symbols, every line offers guidance. In this way, she preserves her hard-won wisdom, passing it quietly to those she trusts, or to future generations who might read between the lines. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of this work. Each evening, after the day's chores are done, she copies out another passage by candlelight. The scratch of the quill, the faint smell of ink, the gentle glow of the flame. These are the rhythms that shape her hidden manuscript. There is comfort, too, in knowing that even if the guild never recognizes her skill, her secrets will not vanish. They are tucked safely inside the walls of the church, protected by the very traditions that tried to keep her out. Years pass, and her manuscript is added to the church's small library, shelved among psalters and homilies. The guild's suspicions fade, and her name slips quietly from their records. But her ale is still remembered in the town, and sometimes a new brewer appears, one who seems to know just when to add the wild herbs, or how to coax a gentle bitterness from the hops, or how to keep the yeast lively through the coldest winter. Some whisper that there is a secret text hidden among the church books, a psalter that offers more than prayers to those with eyes to see. Occasionally, a visiting scholar or novice, tasked with copying out old manuscripts, finds something strange in the margins. A passage that describes not a saint's journey, but a sequence of steps that feels oddly practical, almost culinary. The tradition endures quietly, encoded in the memory of ink and parchment, waiting for anyone with the patience and curiosity to discover it. And so the brewer's legacy continues, not in the halls of power or the records of guilds, but in the careful, encoded lines of a manuscript hidden in plain sight. Imagine yourself leafing through the yellowed pages, the dust rising in the beams of afternoon sun, and recognizing, between the prayers and invocations, a set of instructions meant for hands as careful and determined as your own. In that moment, you might understand the quiet courage it took to outwit the world, and the gentle satisfaction of knowing that some secrets are kept best not by hiding, but by teaching those willing to learn how to look. The mason's daughter who built a chapel without a signature. Imagine yourself in the early morning chill of a medieval worksite, the world muffled by mist and the distant ring of hammers already echoing across unfinished stone. You stand at the edge of a rising chapel, modest in size but ambitious in design, its walls climbing steadily under the careful guidance of masons and laborers. Among the bustle, you notice a young woman moving with purpose, her dress marked with chalk and dust, her hair bound out of the way, sleeves rolled high. She consults with the chief stonecutter, gestures toward a half-carved arch, then, with an unhesitating step, climbs the scaffolding to inspect the alignment herself. Most would see her as merely the mason's daughter, another pair of hands among many. Yet something in her manner makes it clear she is not simply assisting. She is guiding the very shape of this new sacred space. The chapel's records, like so many from the early 15th century, mention the names of donors, guild masters, and churchmen who oversaw its construction. Nowhere do they credit the young woman whose vision quietly set the project apart. In that era, women in building trades were nearly invisible, allowed to work as helpers, to fetch water or shape mortar, but rarely trusted with decisions or design. Still, among the stones themselves, something more enduring than parchment reveals her presence. A series of small, distinctive carving marks, tiny motifs of wildflowers and curling vines, cut with a particular surety of hand. These motifs, traced by modern scholars, do not match any of the established masters recorded in the region at that time. Instead, They appear on each of the chapel's doorways and window arches, an unspoken signature woven through the stone. Imagine her days as the work progressed. Each morning, she arrived before most of the men, walking the site in silence, checking the lines and plumb of each new course. She might stoop to inspect the chisel marks on a cornerstone, murmuring quiet instructions to a trusted apprentice. At times, she argued quietly with her father over a detail, an angle, a proportion, the curve of a supporting arch. He knew her gift for geometry and her instinct for balance. He also knew that no official record would allow her name beside his, no matter how much of the work was truly hers. Yet the project advanced, shaped as much by her eye as by any hand. Imagine the atmosphere on site. The clatter of mallets on chisels, the hiss of lime slaking in a barrel, the low hum of voices rising in the late afternoon. Workers paused to watch her set a string line, or make a quick correction in chalk on a block about to be set. Some respected her skill openly. Others muttered, wary of a woman's presence in a world guarded by guild rules and tradition. Still, it became clear that, when a measurement was uncertain or a problem arose, she would be quietly consulted. The chapel's construction spanned nearly 3 years, a period of difficult weather and tightening budgets. At times, only a handful of masons worked each day, and the young woman took on extra tasks herself, climbing ladders, hoisting smaller stones, even mixing mortar. Through it all, she continued to carve her quiet motifs wherever she could, adding a layer of beauty to otherwise plain surfaces. In the evenings, when the site was empty, she would trace her fingers along the newly finished window, making sure the tracery was smooth, the curves true. Sometimes, she pressed a wildflower into the mortar as a secret mark, knowing it would be invisible beneath the finished surface. When the chapel was completed, the priest and local dignitaries gathered for the blessing. The mason, her father, was thanked, as were the donors and the parish committee. The young woman stood to the side, hands folded, her contribution a silent echo in the stones around her. Over time, those who knew the truth grew old, and the chapel's origins blurred into local legend. Her story was not recorded in any official chronicle. Yet in quiet moments, parishioners sometimes noticed the peculiar wildflower carvings, or the perfect symmetry of the arches, and wondered aloud whose hand had shaped them. Centuries passed. The chapel withstood wars, weather, and the gradual erosion of its purpose, sometimes serving as a schoolroom or storeroom before being restored again for worship. When art historians finally studied the building in detail, they noticed the consistency and uniqueness of the carvings, marks that did not match those of known guild members. Careful analysis traced similar motifs to a handful of other small buildings in the region, each linked by oral history to a mason's daughter who had shown unusual talent and ambition. Today, the chapel still stands, a modest structure, its stones soft with age and lichen, wildflowers often blooming at its foundation. Visitors who linger over the carved details find a quiet richness there, a personal touch absent from grander buildings. If you were to stand in the early morning hush, your hand resting on the cool stone, you might sense the legacy of its builder, a young woman who shaped a sanctuary with vision, skill, and quiet courage, leaving her mark not in written record, but in every wildflower motif, every arch that curves with impossible grace. Her name is lost, but her signature endures, visible to any who know where and how to look. The blacksmith's wife who forged pilgrimage tokens at night. In the village, the days followed a familiar pattern. Roosters called through the morning haze, and the stone cottages gathered heat from the slow-burning sun. You might imagine yourself in a small house where the air always seemed to carry a faint tang of iron and smoke. A home just steps away from the blacksmith's open workshop. The village blacksmith, like most men of his trade, was a presence you'd notice. His arms bore the marks of years at the forge, and each sunrise found him working with a measured rhythm, shaping tools for farmers, mending the occasional plow, and on rare days, repairing a sword brought in by a passing stranger. But our story tonight belongs not to him, but to his wife, a woman whose name history never recorded, yet whose quiet work touched the hands of strangers far beyond the field she knew. In daylight, she tended her family's needs. She mended linens worn thin by work, fetched water from the communal well, and, when she could, set a small pot of herbs to steep on the hearth. Her movements were those of someone who had learned to listen, to the wind rattling the shutters, to the distant church bell, to the steady ring of hammer on anvil next door. As dusk settled, the village shifted. Meals were simple, bowls of pottage shared by the glow of a single candle. Shadows gathered in the corners, and the world grew hushed. After her husband slipped into sleep, the blacksmith's wife would wait, listening to the silence deepen. Then she would rise, careful not to wake the household. She padded quietly through the house and out to the forge, the floor gritty with old ash. The iron tools, her husband's by day, became hers by night. The forge, a great belly of coals, would be coaxed back to life with gentle, practiced hands. She worked by the muted glow of embers, her face lit in soft orange. In her hands were molds carved from clay or soapstone, shaped in secret. She did not make horseshoes or sickles. She made small, shining tokens, badges stamped with the image of a saint or a sacred shrine. Sometimes a scallop shell, sometimes a cross, always marked with a place pilgrims yearned to reach. Pilgrimage was a hope that reached even the smallest villages, a slow, arduous journey that only the lucky or the desperate attempted. But her tokens could travel farther than any local farmer, carried on the cloak of a traveler, sewn into a purse, clutched in a prayerful hand at the roadside. Imagine the rhythm. The hiss of water as a metal blank was cooled, the faint scraping as she polished each token with scraps of old cloth, the soft clink as they gathered in a wooden bowl. No one else in the village stayed awake at these hours. The world beyond the forge was dark, filled only with the distant hooting of an owl or the soft shifting of cattle in their stalls. Sometimes, a gust of wind would stir the ashes or rattle the door, and she would pause, heart quickening, but there was never anyone watching. Her tokens were not simply trinkets. In an age where travel was perilous and news slow to arrive, these badges served as proof of faith, of effort, sometimes even of survival. For some, the badge was a promise to return. For others, a prayer for healing or forgiveness. Local pilgrims, those rare souls who could afford the journey to a far-off shrine, would find her tokens through whispers and quiet exchanges. A woman selling herbs at market, a shepherd lingering at the church door, an old widow with an injured foot. They all heard of the blacksmith's wife who could provide a blessing that fit in your pocket. By morning, the evidence was gone. She would sweep the floor and cool the last embers, her hands carrying the faint scent of smoke and metal back to her bed. When the blacksmith rose at dawn, he would find nothing amiss, the forge ready for his heavy work and the tokens tucked safely out of sight. You may wonder why she took such risks. Forging tokens was not strictly illegal, but it skirted the edge of what was proper. In some regions, only certain towns or church authorities could produce official pilgrimage badges, and there were rumors of heavy fines or worse for forgers. But for the blacksmith's wife, the risk was less important than the quiet fulfillment. She saw the need for hope, for small blessings, for something tangible to carry on the long, uncertain road. Perhaps, too, she found in the secret work of freedom unavailable in her waking life. A chance to leave her mark on the world, even if no one would ever know her name. Her life was shaped by contrasts. By day, she was a wife, a helper, a figure almost invisible in the rhythm of village life. By night, she was a creator, an artisan whose hands shaped faith and fortune. The tokens she made traveled to distant cathedrals, to holy wells, across rivers and forests and mountains she would never see. Sometimes in church, she would glimpse the shine of her own handiwork pinned to a stranger's cloak, and she would feel a quiet sense of kinship, a thread connecting her ordinary life to the vast, unseen tapestry of a wider world. As time passed, her tokens outlasted many of the people who wore them. Some were buried with their owners, small badges clutched in stiff hands. Others were lost along muddy roads, uncovered centuries later by the tines of a plow or the patient brush of an archaeologist. In museums today, if you look closely at a battered medieval badge, you might see the faintest evidence of her artistry, a unique curve, a mark left by her careful hand. And though history never recorded her name, the rhythm of her knights, the quiet courage of her craft, endures in the shine of every pilgrimage token that ever carried hope from a small, smoke-scented forge to the uncertain world beyond. The glass artisan who crafted stained panels under a male alias. Imagine yourself wandering through a quiet medieval chapel, your footsteps softened by centuries of dust that settled on ancient stone. Overhead, shafts of colored light tumble through stained glass panels, casting patterns that ripple gently across the flagstones. Each window is a puzzle of jewel-like fragments, some deep sapphire, others gold or the delicate pink of morning clouds. The artistry is so precise that you pause, tracing the outlines of birds and flowers, leaves twisting into forms that seem almost to move in the shifting light. Most visitors never look closely at the corners of these panels, but if you do, you might notice a peculiar symbol. 2 letters entwined, simple and easy to overlook. It's just a mark, mistaken for a man's initials, but behind it lies a quiet story of ingenuity and secrecy. In a world where glassblowing was a jealously guarded trade, usually passed from father to son, the notion of a woman learning to master its secrets was almost unthinkable. The art itself required more than talent. It demanded long hours at the furnace, strength to shape molten glass, and an ability to calculate the subtle balances of minerals and heat. Workshops were noisy places, filled with the whoosh of bellows, the hiss of cooling water, and the low, urgent conversations of craftsmen discussing commissions for chapels or manor houses. Here, knowledge moved in a rhythm as precise as the seasons, with apprentices rising before dawn and older masters tending the kilns late into the night. Imagine, then, the challenge of slipping unnoticed into this world. Our artisan's childhood unfolded on the edge of the workshop, the daughter of a glass cutter whose hands had grown too unsteady for fine work. At first, she watched from the threshold, learning the rhythms of the shop, the order in which pigments were added to create cobalt or emerald glass, the way a glowing bubble of molten sand could be coaxed into a perfect pane. Over time, her father allowed her to sweep the floor, fetch sand or firewood, and, when no one was looking, to watch as he mended fractures in the glass, humming under his breath. In the gentle hush of evening, he showed her how to shape scraps into simple beads, always warning her to keep these lessons quiet. The world outside the workshop was structured and predictable, filled with the hum of market days, the clatter of hooves on stone, and the calls of merchants selling their wares. For women, daily life was a tapestry of repetition. Baking bread, tending to gardens, spinning wool. The rhythm of these routines provided stability, but also made the rare moments of quiet learning precious. By the time she reached adolescence, our artisan understood that open ambition would bring suspicion. Instead, she shaped her practice around the shadows, rising before the sun to gather offcuts from the workshop floor, testing the strength of each piece by the way it caught the morning light. Apprenticeships, in theory, were open to anyone with the right connections, but in practice, guild rules made them almost impossible for women to enter. The few records that survive suggest that our artisan disguised her work under a borrowed name, signing each piece with a symbol that could be easily misread. She developed a shorthand, a swirl that might look like J or L, depending on the angle, and a single that meant to resemble a period between initials. In the accounts of local priests and merchants, her windows were credited to a man, one who never attended guild meetings or appeared at public ceremonies, but whose work was quietly sought after for its unusual quality. What set her panels apart was not just the delicacy of the glass, but the imagery woven into each design. A sparrow, its wings shaped from slivers of gold and blue, might perch beside a rose whose petals formed a hidden word. Leaves spiraled in patterns echoing the initials in the corner, while the background sometimes contained subtle symbols. A ladder, a single star, or a pair of clasped hands, each with its own private meaning. To most observers, these were simply beautiful windows, decoration for prayer or quiet contemplation. But to those who learned to read the signs, the panels told stories of perseverance, hope, and the longing for recognition. Imagine the hush of a workshop late at night, after the day's labor is finished. The furnace embers glow faintly, casting orange light against the blackened stones. Our artisan, alone but alert, shapes a fragment of glass with careful pressure, watching it cool and set into the design. Outside, the town has fallen silent. Even the market dogs are asleep. She listens to the steady rhythm of her own breath, the faint crackle of the cooling kiln, and feels the old anxiety settling around her. Fear of discovery, pride in her secret skill, and the knowledge that each finished panel is both a risk and a reward. The finished windows were carried by cart to nearby churches and manors, installed under the supervision of a foreman who credited their work to the initials on the corner. Payment was delivered, sometimes in coin, sometimes in trade, and our artisan's father quietly handled the records. The town benefited from these commissions. The chapels glowed with new light, and visitors came from neighboring villages to admire the artistry. Yet the true identity of the artist remained unspoken. A secret shared between father and daughter, passed along in the small gestures of everyday life. As you imagine the panels catching the morning sun, consider the contrast between their beauty and the ordinary rhythms of the world outside. Women hung laundry across narrow lanes, their fingers stained from the day's work. Artisans sharpened blades, mended tools, and argued over the price of raw materials. The church bells marked the hours, calling people to prayer or rest. Within this landscape, the stained glass windows stood as quiet evidence of a hidden talent, one that challenged the boundaries of gender, even if it could never be named aloud. Over time, rumors of the artisan's identity slipped into local legend. Some whispered that the initials stood for a master who traveled constantly, never remaining in one place. Others claimed the panels were made by a family of brothers, each with a slightly different style. Only a handful guessed the truth, and even then, their suspicions faded with the passing of years, woven into the larger rhythm of village memory. Today, a few of those panels remain, tucked into the corners of old chapels, their colors faded by time, but their imagery still distinct. If you find yourself alone in such a space, let your gaze linger on the smallest details. A pair of hands hidden among the vines, the curve of a bird's wing, or the mark in the corner that looks like a man's name. Behind that symbol lies a quiet defiance, a story of patience and skill, and the comfort that comes from knowing even the most hidden work can catch the light if you know how to look for it. The apothecary woman who traded remedies across borders. Imagine yourself at the edge of a border village, in the dim hours before sunrise, when the roads are nearly silent save for the occasional creak of a wagon and the soft clatter of wooden clogs on damp cobblestones. Among the figures who move quietly through these early morning shadows, one stands out by her purposeful pace and the neat bundle she carries. An apothecary woman, known to the locals as a midwife, but trusted by many for far more. Her journey was always careful, never hurried. Wrapped in the practical, undistinguished garb of a traveling healer, she navigated a landscape where every town had its own laws, and every border checkpoint was manned by officials alert for contraband and forbidden remedies. At a glance, she appeared to be just another midwife, an occupation respected, if sometimes regarded with wary curiosity. But hidden within her baskets of swaddling cloths and dried sage, she carried vials and packets of substances that were strictly prohibited by the authorities. These remedies were far from ordinary. Some were drawn from centuries-old recipes copied by candlelight in her small, cluttered workspace. Others were learned from passing healers, or carefully bartered from apothecaries who traded secrets only to those they trusted completely. There were infusions for fever that would not break, salves for festering wounds, tinctures for pain, and rare powders that could coax a failing heart to beat just a little longer. Her role as a midwife was the perfect disguise. It allowed her to visit noble estates and peasant cottages alike, offering aid that was welcomed and rarely questioned. If a child was born sickly, or a mother struggled to recover from the ordeal of childbirth, she would be summoned. She would arrive with gentle hands and soft words, often using the opportunity to leave behind a bottle or a poultice that was not on any official list. Sometimes, the remedy was for the suffering relative of a nobleman. At other times, it was for a farmer's aging wife, or a merchant's son taken ill after a journey. Merchant checkpoints were the greatest risk. Borders were tense with suspicion, especially during seasons of plague or famine, when herbal medicines could be outlawed in favor of remedies sanctioned by the church or city guilds. When questioned, she showed her supplies of birthing herbs and prayer tokens. Always calm, her eyes cast down as if embarrassed by the scrutiny. To those who searched closely, she explained that her special teas were for mother's nerves, or that a tightly corked jar held nothing more than soothing balm for swollen ankles. She was careful never to use her real name. In one village, she was called Mother Herlind. In another, simply the midwife. She left no signature, never accepted written receipts, and never lingered in one place long enough to be remembered as anything but a helpful visitor. Yet, over time, her reputation grew. Stories spread of a healer who could bring a feverish child back from the brink, or who saved a nobleman's daughter with a remedy that no court physician dared to recommend. Those in need learned to leave word at inns or market stalls. A ribbon tied to a certain fence, a coin wrapped in cloth and left near a well. Soon after, she would appear, quiet and precise, her only payment the knowledge that she had eased suffering where she found it. The consequences of her work were not always visible. If a noble family regained its heir, a village survived a wave of sickness, or a merchant's daughter returned to health, no public thanks would be given. Official records ignored her entirely. Only the faintest references survive in diaries and private letters. Sometimes, local priests would wonder at the speed of a recovery and mutter about border witches, but could find no evidence to act upon. As you imagine the rhythm of her days, you see her moving from manor to cottage, carrying her secrets wrapped in linen. She works by lamplight, her hands stained with crushed leaves and oils. Each morning, she rises before dawn to avoid suspicion, and each night she travels new roads, always watching for the glint of a soldier's halberd or the seal of a city guard. Her patients are from every class, and though she risks much, her loyalty is always to those who need her most. When the seasons change, she moves on, sometimes just ahead of new laws, sometimes because word has spread a little too far. She leaves behind healthier communities, a few grateful families, and always the quiet memory of a woman who arrived when hope was fading. No statue marks her passing, no chronicle records her name. Yet the rhythm of her life, careful, tireless, and always on the move, remains woven into the quiet health of those who survived because she dared to cross borders, hidden in plain sight, remedies in hand. The mill worker who altered water flow without permission. Imagine yourself beside a slow, winding stream on the edge of a medieval village. The early morning air is cool, thick with the scent of wet grass and the steady rumble of water against worn stones. At the heart of the settlement stands the mill, its timbers darkened by years of weather. The great wheel endlessly turning as water from the mill race spins its paddles and powers the gears within. The mill is more than a building. It is the quiet engine of village life, grinding grain for bread, providing work, and shaping the rhythm of each day. The operation of the sluice gates, which control the rush of water toward the wheel, is a matter of pride and authority. Officially, only the miller and a handful of trusted men are allowed to tend the gates, adjusting them to account for rainfall, drought, or the demands of the harvest. The balance is delicate. Too little water, and the stones grind slow and uneven. Too much, and the wheel shudders dangerously, threatening the whole structure. Into this closed world steps a woman, known to all as a mill worker, but never granted the full respect of a craftswoman. She spends her days hauling sacks, clearing debris, and tending to the endless maintenance required by water and wood. Yet as she works, she watches. She studies the way currents shift around the sluice, how a single adjustment in the angle of a board can change the wheel's speed. She listens to the conversations of the men, piecing together knowledge they share freely among themselves but never imagined she might use. Night after night, she thinks about the pattern she observes. The water's reluctance when the channel is blocked with silt, the waste when the gates are left too wide, the moments when a minor change would yield greater force. There is no textbook for her to follow, no diagrams to study. Only the slow, accumulating wisdom of repeated days and a mind unwilling to accept things as they are simply because they have always been so. One evening, when the others have left and the sky is deepening into violet, she lingers by the sluice gates. The water glimmers with the last traces of daylight. With steady hands, she adjusts the boards, not by guesswork, but with deliberate, measured changes. She has calculated the precise arrangement that might let more water spin the wheel, without risking damage or waste. The new pattern is subtle, almost invisible to a casual glance, but in the days that follow, the difference becomes clear. The mill runs smoother, the stones grind faster, and the flour is finer than before. At first, the improvement is attributed to luck, a fortunate turn of weather, perhaps, or the ordinary ebb and flow of the river. But as the weeks pass, it becomes undeniable. The output exceeds expectations, surpassing even the officials' most optimistic plans. Word spreads through the village, bringing both quiet pride and unwanted scrutiny. It is then that suspicion falls. The men in charge examine the sluice gates and realize adjustments have been made without their approval. Rather than celebrate the success, they focus on the breach of protocol. To change the system without permission is to challenge authority itself. And the idea that a woman might have outperformed the officials' carefully measured plans stirs discomfort rather than admiration. Imagine the conversations that follow, spoken in the low, careful tones of those who wish to avoid open conflict, but cannot let the matter rest. The official convenes a meeting, examining the records, inspecting the machinery, and questioning the workers. In this world, innovation is not always welcomed, especially when it comes from the margins. The woman is called forward. Her skill is not praised. Instead, she is blamed for breaking the established order, accused of meddling, and quietly dismissed from the more technical tasks. Yet, the story does not end there. The new method works. The improved flow becomes standard practice, adopted without credit, quietly absorbed into the routine of daily life. Over time, villagers come to accept the better yield as a matter of course, and the reason for the improvement fades into silence. The official's pride remains intact, the mill runs as it should, and the woman, though returned to her lesser duties, continues to observe and adapt, her influence present even when her name is not. Imagine her standing once more by the water's edge, listening to the murmur of the stream beneath the moon. The air is cool, the village quiet, and the wheel turns smoothly in the dark. She knows the truth of what she accomplished, even if it goes unspoken. Hers is a legacy without recognition, a small but lasting change written into the flow of water and the gentle hum of the mill. And so, the rhythm of the village endures. The grain is ground, the bread is baked, and life goes on, unaware, perhaps, that sometimes the greatest improvements arrive quietly, in the hands of those whom history rarely remembers, whose best work is carried by the current, unclaimed and unstoppable. The scribe's niece who illuminated manuscripts by moonlight. Imagine yourself in a small stone chamber lit by the faint, silvery blue of the moon, filtered through a high, narrow window. The walls are lined with rough wooden shelves, each one crowded with vellum and parchment, their edges curling slightly from years of careful handling. A single candle burns low on the heavy table, though much of the light in the room tonight comes from the quiet glow of the moon. You notice a young woman seated at the table, her hair tied back, her ink-stained fingers deftly guiding a fine-tipped brush along the margin of a half-finished page. She pauses now and again, listening for footsteps, then continues, her hands steady, her attention absolute. She is known to the household only as the scribe's niece, a relation taken in after the death of her parents. The master scribe, responsible for producing religious texts for the nearby monastery, is both her uncle and her teacher. In the formal records, only his name appears, alongside the illuminated manuscripts that pass through this quiet workshop. Yet as you observe, you realize it is she who brings the pages to life in the stillness of night, painting not only the required flourishes of vine and acanthus, but also a hidden world of foxes darting among the saints and curling beneath the feet of apostles. Imagine the rhythm of her evenings. During the day, she assists her uncle, grinding pigments, preparing quills, and laying gold leaf according to his instructions. Her own brushwork is reserved for the hours after sunset, when the household sleeps and the risk of discovery lessens. She sits, candle guttering in its holder, the faintest draft stirring the edges of her work. In these quiet hours, her style takes on a life of its own. Foxes rendered with lively eyes and mischievous tails, subtle as a secret in the margin, yet always just present enough to catch the glance of a careful reader. The rules of her world are rigid. Women are forbidden from official roles in the scriptorium, let alone the credit that might come with their work. Still, the niece persists, blending her efforts seamlessly with her uncle's, so that to most observers the finished manuscript seems the work of a single practiced hand. Only those who look closely notice the playful energy that enters the margins, a gentle counterpoint to the solemnity of the main text. Imagine her thoughts as she paints. Perhaps she chooses foxes because they are clever, always surviving at the edge of fields and forests, unclaimed and unwelcome in most stories, but vital just the same. Or perhaps the animals are her small act of defiance, a quiet joke to herself and to the handful of readers perceptive enough to notice. As her uncle reviews the day's work, he gives no sign of noticing the new details, but sometimes you wonder if a slight smile flickers across his face, as if he recognizes her hidden signature and will say nothing. The manuscripts that leave their small workshop are prized by the monks and patrons who receive them. They praise the clarity of the script and the brilliance of the gold leaf. But in time, a few begin to comment on the unusual liveliness of the margins. One abbot writes of the creatures who lurk among the saints as though bearing secret news from the wild. Another, more cautious, suggests that some details might verge on playful, almost irreverent. But the demand for the books never wanes, and so the scribe's niece continues, night after night, her brushwork growing ever more assured. Years pass. The niece's identity is never entered in any record, and when her uncle dies, the workshop closes. The manuscripts are scattered among collections, libraries, and private chapels. Over centuries, her name is forgotten, but the foxes remain, hiding in the company of saints, sometimes peering out from behind a crozier, sometimes curled at the hem of a bishop's robe, always a little out of place, always undeniably present. It is only in recent years, as scholars catalog the illuminated manuscripts of the region, that a pattern emerges. Pages bearing the playful foxes share a certain vibrancy, a lightness of line, and a wry intelligence in composition. Art historians begin to refer to the fox painter, a mystery artist whose true name is lost, but whose touch is instantly recognizable. Debates arise. Some insist the hand belongs to a minor master. Others quietly suspect a woman, though the evidence is circumstantial and the record silent. Imagine yourself now, centuries later, standing before one of these manuscripts in a museum's gentle light. You trace the margins with your eyes, finding foxes hidden among saints as they once hid in fields. A private world of wit and survival pressed into the corners of sacred history. You may never know her name, but you know her presence, alive in every playful figure, every detail that whispers of talent, humor, and longing to be seen. So the scribe's niece endures, her story woven through the very pages she was never allowed to sign. In the hush of the library, in the quiet marvel of a reader's discovery, she is both everywhere and nowhere. A fleeting trace of moonlight, a brushstroke at the edge of history, and a fox still running, just out of reach. The carpenter's widow who built coffins for nobles in disguise. Imagine a village just after the plague. A hush over the fields, the old tracks through the forest now empty, as if the world itself had grown shy. The roads, once rutted by carts and voices, lay softened by moss and silence. Most families had lost someone. Some had lost everyone. Tradesmen's tools were left hanging on hooks, gathering a fine layer of dust and memory. But the work of death, quiet necessary, did not end when the fever burned itself out. On the edge of the woods, where the sunlight slipped through high, leafy branches and birds called quietly to each other, lived a widow. Her cottage was built by her husband, a carpenter once known for his fine joinery. She remembered the smell of sawdust in his beard, the way his hands had been nicked and scarred from years of careful shaping. When the sickness came, he worked until the fevers took him, and then the house grew quiet, and the world outside seemed to shrink. Yet, necessity has its own rhythm. The village had coffins to build, and then the need spread, beyond peasants, to the great houses, to noble families who wished for privacy, for silence, for the assurance that their dead would be laid to rest with dignity and skill. With the men gone, the widow took up her husband's tools. She worked alone, her movements steady and unhurried, measuring the planks against the span of her arms, marking with chalk, shaping and smoothing until the wood fit together with a gentle final click. Her workshop was the open air. She chose a place among the trees, where the scent of pine and leaf mixed with the sharper tang of sap and oiled steel. Sometimes, the distant bells of the church could be heard, muffled and slow, a faint reminder that life in the village continued even as she labored for the dead. The widow's hands learned to shape the wood so the grain caught the light, to line each coffin with care, so that no splinter would trouble the final sleep. She chose sturdy timbers, sealed each joint, and polished the surfaces until they were soft beneath the palm. Her work, though humble in its purpose, became quietly renowned. Word spread not in the market square, but in whispers, along paths trodden by servants of the manor, by stewards who carried grief with discretion. Nobles, fearful of gossip or scandal, sent envoys in secret to the woods, exchanging silver for silence. Few ever saw the craftsman at work. They imagined, perhaps, an old apprentice or a traveling journeyman, never suspecting that the skill behind each elegant coffin belonged to a woman, alone in her grief and her craft. She took no pride in the sorrow that filled her days, but in the dignity of the work itself. There is a certain comfort in routine, in the smooth rasp of the plane, the weight of the hammer, the steady breath of the forest. In the evenings, she wiped her hands clean and carried the leftover shavings home, using them to kindle the fire. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of her workshop, looking at the empty woods and listening for the far-off laughter of children or the muted sounds of a feast from the manor on the hill. Mostly, there was only the wind. Noble families, grateful for the beauty and discretion of her work, sent wordless gifts. A bolt of fine cloth, a basket of apples, a candle with a scent of beeswax and honey. Each gesture was left at the edge of the trees, with no note, no acknowledgement. She understood the unspoken gratitude. the delicate balance of secrecy and survival that shaped every transaction in those uncertain years. Over time, her coffins traveled farther than she ever did. They rested in family crypts and beneath the flagstones of cold chapels. In death, the noble and the commoner lay side by side, but her work ensured that each was honored in their passing. There was no signature, no maker's mark beyond the careful joinery and the soft sheen of well-finished wood. Only those who had seen her in the quiet hours, perhaps a curious child or a servant sent with payment, might ever have guessed the truth. Years passed, and the forests grew thicker. The village slowly returned to life. New craftsmen took up the trade, never suspecting the legacy left in the silent woods. The widow grew old, her hands still steady, her heart quietly at peace with the choices she had made. In the end, when her own time came, there was no elaborate procession, no grand display. Just a simple box, well made, lined with love and memory, perhaps shaped by her own hands in quieter years. So if you ever walk through a shaded wood and find the remains of an old workbench, or a scatter of sawdust caught between tree roots, imagine the quiet life that once filled that space. The gentle persistence of a woman who worked in secret, crafting dignity for strangers who would never know her name. In the rhythm of her days, the world found a little more peace, and history kept her secret, soft as moss beneath the trees. The rope maker who used her own hair to prove strength. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village where the wind tugs constantly at the thatched rooftops and narrow lanes curve around simple cottages. At the heart of the village stands a squat stone church, its bell tower topped by a weathered cross. You hear the bell most mornings, a dull, steady note echoing through the mist. But what most villagers do not see is the story of the bell's support. A rope of unusual strength, woven not only from hemp, but from something even more remarkable. Its maker, a woman known for her quiet persistence, left behind a lesson about resilience and pride, woven strand by strand through her own hair. The craft of rope making was often the preserve of men, passed down through guild apprenticeships and family workshops. Ropes were the lifelines of daily survival, binding hay, tethering livestock, securing boats on the nearby river. The work was laborious and repetitive. Fibers had to be soaked, twisted, and woven by hand. The rhythm of the work nearly meditative. Most rope was made from hemp or flax, sometimes from horsehair or reeds. In the village, the rope maker's hut was filled with the earthy smell of drying plant fibers. The floor dusted with broken strands and tiny knots of waste. Our rope maker grew up learning the trade from her father, her hands nimble and strong. She knew the value of even patient twisting, the way fibers must be coaxed, not forced into alignment. As a woman in this trade, she faced questions at every turn. Merchants from larger towns doubted her skill, suggesting that her ropes would fray or snap under real strain. Some refused to buy. Others offered less than a fair price. Even among neighbors, she sometimes overheard doubts. Comments about how a woman's strength was best saved for weaving cloth or baking bread, not for the demanding work of the rope walk. But she understood the rhythm of her work, and she also understood pride. When the church bell's old rope snapped in a summer storm, the priest came to her for help. The replacement would need to be strong enough to hold the heavy iron bell through winter's fiercest gales. When I slicked the tower steps and winds howled across the village green, she gathered her best hemp, combing through the fibers with a practiced hand. Then, almost as an afterthought, she drew from a small wooden box her own collection of hair, gathered over years, saved from combs and braids, cleaned and stored in neat bundles. She began to braid the new rope, incorporating the hair alongside the hemp in careful, even spirals. The process took days. Early in the morning, she worked alone, her fingers following the familiar dance of twisting, binding, checking for evenness. Her hair, finer than hemp, added a sheen to the rope's surface and, more importantly, a tensile strength that surprised even her. She imagined the cord as a silent challenge, a testament to endurance and craft. She did not announce what she had done, simply delivered the rope to the bell tower with her usual quiet manner. The bell was hoisted anew, the rope fastened to the clapper and looped over its iron brace. The first time the bell was rung, it sang through the chill air, steady and unbroken. Word spread quickly among the villagers, and, more slowly, among the merchants who had doubted her. When autumn storms swept across the fields and the bell's note cut through thunder and wind, the strength of the rope became legend. One by one, those who had questioned her skill inspected the cord, feeling its firmness, noting the unexpected smoothness where the light caught on the hair woven through the fibers. The story moved beyond the village in quiet ripples. Merchants traveling through asked about the rope that had never snapped. Some offered her better prices. Others sought her advice on twisting techniques or fiber blends. The rope maker, for her part, remained steady in her routine. She continued to gather her materials, to twist and braid in the early morning hours, to listen to the bell's call as it marked the rhythm of daily life. In the years that followed, her quiet act of defiance faded into local legend. Children learned to point out the bell rope as something special, and sometimes on a sunny afternoon, a visitor would be allowed to hold a piece of the old cord, marveling at the hidden strands of hair that gave it strength. For most, it was simply a curiosity, but for those who understood the work, the repetition, the patience, the pride, her story became a gentle reminder that true strength can be both visible and unseen, braided from the very fibers of who you are. Imagine yourself now standing in that small stone church, the sunlight angled through high windows, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the hush of your own breathing. You run your fingers along the bell rope, feeling the subtle difference where hair and hemp meet. In that texture, you find the memory of persistence and the quiet certainty that sometimes the work you do in answer to doubt becomes its own kind of bell, ringing clear above the wind, long after the questions have faded away. Imagine yourself wandering the edges of a noble estate in the cool, pale hours before sunrise, when the grass is still damp and the world feels suspended between darkness and day. From beyond a line of dew-laden hedges comes a faint, unmistakable sound. The sudden beat of wings, the sharp whistle of a falcon cutting through the air. The lord and his guests, still at rest within the manor, would tell tales of the skillful men who trained their hunting birds. Yet it was in these quiet, hidden moments that the true master of the muse revealed herself. The falconer's wife, whose name never reached the records, but whose hand shaped every feather and every flight. In a world where noblemen boasted of their hawks and falcons, the craft of training these extraordinary creatures was a mark of both status and subtle power. The men paraded their skill in court and field, discussing breeding lines and the finer points of falconry with all the confidence that rank and custom could afford. But behind the stone walls of the muse, in the first slanting light of dawn, it was often the falconer's wife who coaxed and calmed the birds, teaching them not only obedience but trust. Her days began long before the others stirred. Dressed plainly, her hands roughened by work, she moved quietly among the wooden perches and straw-lined pens. The air was cool and tinged with the scent of grain, feathers, and the earthiness of early morning. She spoke in soft, almost secret tones, using the same words and rhythms each day until her birds learned her language. Not merely the whistle and command, but the cadence of reassurance, the promise of safety, the invitation to return. Training a bird of prey was no simple task. Young hawks arrived nervous, defensive, untrusting of any hand. Where some men relied on brute force or bluster, she used patience. She studied each bird's temperament, learned to sense the subtle shifts in their bodies, the twitch of a talon, the narrowing of an eye, that signaled restlessness or fear. Her skill lay not in dominance, but in a kind of partnership. It was said among the other workers that she could look a falcon calm, that her mere presence seemed to lower the birds' hackles and draw them nearer. Her husband, officially titled as Falconer, handled the public demonstrations and accepted praise from nobles eager for impressive sport. He spoke of the intricacies of jesses and hoods, explained the technicalities of recall and lure, and issued invitations to observe flights across the fields. Behind the scenes, however, he relied on his wife's uncanny instinct for bird and beast alike. Each new arrival was entrusted to her for the earliest, most delicate stages. Feeding by hand, soothing through their first experiences with human voices, and teaching them to leap from glove to perch with grace. In time, the reputation of the estate's bird spread. Nobles traveling from distant lands requested hawks of the kind kept here. Birds that returned faithfully, that hunted with singular intelligence, that never panicked at the thunder of horses or the sudden shout of a hunter. They did not know that in the chill of pre-dawn, it was her voice the birds responded to, her gentle direction that honed their skills. Requests came in coded language, passed through stewards and valets, always for the birds from this estate, never knowing whose hands had shaped their character. Her contributions were never acknowledged in the ledgers or letters. In official records, her name might appear only as the Falconer's wife, if at all. Yet among the stable boys and kitchen girls, quiet stories grew. Some said that even the wild kestrels would follow her if she walked the edge of the fields. Others whispered that she once nursed a half-frozen goshawk back to life by keeping it in the folds of her cloak all through a bitter winter. There was, in every corner of the Mews, a subtle sense that the real keeper was not the man with the title, but the woman with the listening heart. Imagine her standing in the open meadow at dawn, arm raised, the shadow of a hawk circling overhead. With a single word, sometimes no word at all, she could call the bird to her, its talons settling softly on her gloved fist. Then, as the day brightened and others claimed credit for her work, she would return to her chores, blending back into the rhythm of servants and unseen labor. The pattern of her life, woven into the lives of her birds, left no written record. Only the memory of their unmatched performance, the awe of visiting nobles, and the quiet knowledge passed from worker to worker. As you close your eyes, picture the hush of morning broken by wings and gentle voices, and imagine how many legacies have soared, unrecognized, because of hands like hers, shaping flight in the half-light of another forgotten day. The falconer's wife who secretly trained birds for nobility. The candle maker who disguised trade recipes in religious symbols. Imagine yourself stepping quietly into a dim medieval chapel, your footsteps muffled by old stone and the heavy scent of beeswax and tallow. The flicker of candlelight bathes the walls in shifting gold, casting halos around the painted saints and causing the carved figures to waver at the edges. The air is gentle, edged with the faint sweetness of melting wax, and you can hear, if you listen closely, the soft, almost rhythmic hiss of wicks consuming their tiny ration of flame. Candles in this world are not mere sources of light. They are prayers made visible, offerings of hope and remembrance, their slow burning a sign of devotion and patience. In every church and abbey, their glow marks the passing hours, the silent vigils, the feasts and fasts that shape the year's slow procession. It is here, in these sacred halls, that the story of a particular candlemaker begins to quietly unfold. She was not the first of her craft, nor the most celebrated. Yet those who remember her work speak of an unusual beauty and secret knowledge embedded in every candle she made. In a time when the Candlemakers Guild guarded their methods with secrecy and suspicion, passing down recipes for tallow blends, wax purities, and the art of wick twisting only to trusted apprentices, her innovations stood apart. Denied equal standing within the guild, she observed carefully and worked with a silent, methodical patience. Every day, she watched as men weighed fats and oils, as they dipped wicks in vats of scented wax, as they argued over the merits of flax versus rush. She absorbed each lesson, not only with her eyes and hands, but with the quiet intent of someone who understood her knowledge would need to travel a different, more secret road. The problem was not her skill, but her place, official channels were closed, and her recipes for a slower-burning candle or a smokeless flame were dismissed or, worse, quietly stolen and claimed as someone else's invention. When she attempted to share her ideas directly, she was met with warnings and sometimes with ridicule. The guild tried to silence her voice, enforcing rules meant to keep certain knowledge confined and certain people excluded. But she found another way. Rather than record her recipes on parchment or trust them to memory alone, she began to encode her knowledge directly into the very surface of her craft. Her candles, intended for the altar and the vestry, appeared at first glance to be covered in elaborate decorative symbols. Tiny icons of saints, intricate geometric borders, repeating patterns of doves and vines. To the untrained eye, these designs were simply tokens of reverence, harmless embellishments meant to please the clergy and inspire the faithful. Yet each icon held meaning, each curve and angle a subtle notation. A certain twist in a vine's stem indicated the number of times a wick should be braided for strength. The placement of a halo or the angle of a saint's hand revealed the proportions of tallow and beeswax required for the cleanest burn. The number of petals on a carved rose, the spacing of lines in a decorative border, the way light caught a particular motif. These were all instructions, quietly embedded in beauty. Imagine the satisfaction of this slow, secret work. The hush of the workshop at dawn, the cool slab of stone beneath her tools, the soft, forgiving malleability of newly mixed wax. She would press each symbol into the candle's surface, her fingers dusted with flecks of tallow and the faint shimmer of beeswax, knowing that only those with patient eyes would ever find the recipes hidden there. As her candles found their way into churches and abbeys, the designs began to attract quiet attention. A monk tasked with replenishing the votive lights noticed that the candles burned with remarkable steadiness, leaving little smoke to darken the painted ceilings. A nun in a distant convent, struggling to produce candles that would survive the winter's drafts, recognized a pattern in the wax and tried to imitate it. With success, the knowledge spread slowly, quietly, far beyond the guild's reach. This gentle persistence could not be contained. The guild responded with warnings and fines, but the candles continued to appear. One in a village chapel, another on a bishop's altar, each bearing the same intricate icons. Soon, there were whispers among those who worked in the shadows of the sacred halls, of a candlemaker whose designs seemed to carry blessings in their very form. In time, the guild's hold weakened. Her methods, disguised as prayer and ornament, could not be erased from memory or confiscated by decree. Even as the officials tried to suppress her work, the candles themselves spoke, burning cleaner, lasting longer, teaching in silence those who learned to look and listen. Imagine now, holding one of these candles yourself. The wax is cool and smooth beneath your hand, the carved designs catching the light in gentle relief. As you trace the patterns with your fingertips, you sense the presence of a mind both meticulous and quietly defiant. Someone who refused to let her wisdom vanish, who found a way to outlast the rules meant to silence her. And so her legacy endures, not in the records of the guild, but in the quiet radiance of a flame that burns true, illuminating not only the page or the altar, but the persistent hope that knowledge, once shared, once seen, can never be fully hidden away. In every sacred hall where her candles glow, a little piece of her story continues to shine. The printer's apprentice who smuggled books for women. Imagine yourself in a dim, cramped room at the back of a bustling print shop, the air thick with a sense of ink, flour, and warm yeast. It is just before dawn, and the city's bells have not yet begun their daily song. Outside, market traders call and carts rumble over uneven cobblestones. Inside, the rhythm is quieter. The muffled thud of type being set, the creak of a wooden press, the whisper of pages stacked and counted by lamplight. Here, among the shadows, a young woman moves with practiced care, her hands dusted in flour as often as ink, her eyes always on the door. She is known only as the printer's apprentice. Her official tasks are few: sweeping the floor, delivering messages, sorting type. But when the master printer and his sons turn their backs, she slips into forbidden work, composing lines in secret, cranking the press for hours after the shop should have gone quiet. Her work is delicate and urgent, for what she produces is not meant for the city's elite, but for its women. Guides to letters, herbal remedies, and the occasional story. Books small enough to be hidden, valuable enough to be dangerous. In this time, the laws are clear and harsh. Only men are permitted to hold a printer's license, and only authorized books, religious tracts, government notices, sanctioned stories, are to be produced. Anything else risks confiscation, fines, even imprisonment. The apprentice knows this as well as anyone. She knows, too, that in her part of the city, few women can read, and fewer still have access to printed pages. A woman caught with a forbidden text is blamed not for curiosity, but for defiance. Still, the need persists, and so does the work. Imagine the subtle rituals of each day. When no one is looking, she sets aside slivers of scrap paper, thin as onion skin, and gathers offcuts of twine and glue. She learns to operate the press quietly, to muffle the sound with cloth, to hide finished sheets under the bin of sweepings. The greatest challenge, though, is getting the books out into the world. For this, she enlists allies: a baker whose ovens burn through the night, and a stallholder at the market who trades in ribbons, spices, and small secrets. The baker prepares hollowed loaves, skillfully shaped and baked around bundles of paper, so that a casual inspection reveals only bread, warm and fragrant. The apprentice slips the tiny books inside, binding them in oiled cloth to protect against crumbs and damp. Before sunrise, she delivers the loaves herself, head down and hands full, never speaking more than a word to the baker, whose knowing nod is the only sign of their arrangement. From there, the loaves are sent out across the city, to laundresses, midwives, servants, and daughters. Each woman who receives one knows how to lift the crust, retrieve the pages, and pass them along when her reading is done. At the market, the apprentice weaves through the crowds, always watching, always wary. Behind the stall lined with ribbons and combs, she exchanges coded greetings with the vendor, who slips the small volumes under bolts of cloth or among crates of onions. From there, the texts pass through the hands of buyers who look like any others, their faces unremarkable, their purpose invisible. The printer's apprentice moves through this network quietly, always listening for signs of suspicion. A new guard, an unfamiliar face, a whisper of raids. It is a constant calculation, a rhythm of risk and reward. Imagine the content of these books. Some are practical, offering advice on healing wounds or growing herbs. Others are letters and stories, tales of women's work and cleverness. A few even poems about longing or hope. They are simple in appearance, bound in scraps of leather or folded into stitched pamphlets, the prints sometimes uneven, the illustrations crude but spirited. Yet for those who receive them, these pages are treasures, doorways to new knowledge, quiet encouragement, a reminder that someone out there believes in their right to read, to wonder, to imagine more. There are close calls. Once, a loaf is broken open at the city gate by a guard hungry for a meal. Inside, he finds only a cluster of walnuts, the apprentice having sensed danger that morning and adjusted her routine. Another time, a customer at the market notices a slip of paper caught on a basket handle. The vendor laughs, brushes it away, and slips the page into her sleeve before anyone else can see. Over time, the apprentice's network grows. She becomes a rumor among women who seek her out. Never by name, always through hints and questions. She leaves no trace in the records of the print shop, no initials in the margins, no mention in city rolls. Only the memory of the small books lingers, passed hand to hand, cherished and then hidden away. Centuries later, historians search for evidence of her work, sifting through archives and surviving pamphlets. Sometimes, in the faded ink of an old herbal or a much-handled letter, they notice a pattern, certain turns of phrase, a certain hand in the illustrations, or the presence of foxes and wildflowers in the margins, subtle marks that hint at a single guiding spirit behind them all. But her name remains unknown, her story told only in fragments, her courage unrecorded except in the lives she quietly changed. And so, the printer's apprentice endures, woven into the silent history of those who risked everything to share words and knowledge. When you picture her, imagine her not only at the press or in the market, but among the women who, by candlelight or in secret corners, turned the pages she delivered, finding in them, for a brief moment, a world far larger than their own. The gravedigger's daughter who mapped the cemetery alone. Imagine a cemetery at the edge of a village, where morning mist lingers between leaning stones and the air is thick with the earthy scent of grass, old leaves, and wet clay. The world beyond the cemetery stirs slowly. Roosters call, smoke rises from chimneys, and distant church bells toll. But here, the quiet is almost absolute. This was the world of the gravedigger's daughter, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself and memories settled with the dew. Her father was a man of few words and steady hands. Each day, he shaped new resting places for those who had reached the end of their journey. She learned to read the land beside him. The patches where the soil turned sandy and dry, the places where roots twisted, the hollow sounds where earlier graves had softened the earth. Where others saw only rows of stone and grass, she saw patterns. A silent story written beneath the surface. As she grew older, the daughter found herself returning to the cemetery even when her father's work was done. She moved quietly, a sketchbook tucked beneath her arm, soft pencils worn to nubs. While other children played along the hedgerows or gathered wildflowers, she traced lines in her notebook, copying the shape of each marker and the way the graves undulated in the changing light. Her shoes often carried dust home, and sometimes her fingers were stained from hours spent drawing, mapping, erasing, and redrawing. When her father fell ill and the work of the dead grew heavier, the daughter quietly took over the smallest tasks, smoothing earth, replacing pebbles, keeping weeds from swallowing the older stones. The men who supervised the burials, gravediggers from other villages or church-appointed overseers, regarded her work with amused suspicion. Some called her maps pointless, saying, "The dead don't care about neat rows or little sketches." Others dismissed her careful markers as childish superstition, as if only prayers or rituals mattered once the soil closed overhead. But the daughter understood the danger of forgetting. Years of hardship, plague, and war had changed the cemetery's shape. Some graves lost their stones to weather. Others were left unmarked for lack of family or money. On quiet evenings, she would walk the paths with a lantern, stopping at each grave to compare her notes to what remained above ground. She drove simple wooden stakes into the earth where markers had vanished, tying scraps of cloth or pressed flowers as gentle reminders. Her maps grew more detailed each season. She recorded not only names and dates, but the tilt of each headstone, the shadows cast by the tallest yews, the places where rainwater pooled or wild violets spread across forgotten mounds. She drew little flourishes for unmarked graves, inventing symbols, a small cross, a curled leaf, a spiral for the unknown. To her, each plot was a story, a memory saved from being erased by the slow turn of seasons. Sometimes, families arrived searching for ancestors. They were grateful for her guidance, following as she pointed out where a long-lost uncle might lie, or showing them the place where a grandmother's name had faded from the old limestone. Her careful notes brought comfort in quiet ways. A child's grave found again, a space kept safe from being disturbed by future burials. Still, the men scoffed. Just lines on paper, they'd say, or no one will care in 100 years. But the daughter kept working, unmoved by laughter or careless words. She took pride in the rhythm of her days. The gentle scrape of pencil, the crisp turning of pages, the calm certainty that even as the world around her changed, she would not let these stories be lost. Years passed. Moss grew thick on the oldest stones, and storms sometimes toppled a cross or blurred a name beyond recognition. Yet her maps remained. Each revision folded atop the last, a gentle archive against forgetting. Some evenings, as the sun dipped low and the world glowed gold and green, she would walk the paths one last time, her sketches tucked beneath her arm, and feel a quiet peace. She knew where every soul rested, every stone, and every mound. In the end, when she was older and her hands ached from years of drawing and care, others began to notice the value in her quiet work. The church found her maps useful when questions arose about unmarked plots. Local families sought her out when new burials were planned, hoping to avoid disturbing the sleeping dead. Over time, what was once dismissed as superstition became a guide, a testament to the memory and dignity she offered, alone with her pencil and lantern among the silent stones. So if you ever wander through an old cemetery and see the rows neat and true, or find a faded map in an archive showing careful notations and gentle marks, imagine the hands that made it. The gravedigger's daughter, walking quietly through the mist, determined that no name, no life, would slip away unnoticed in the hush of time. The fisherwoman who wove nets stronger than imported ones. Imagine yourself on the stony shore of a coastal village at dawn, the tide whispering across shingle and gulls calling in the pale light. The air is thick with the scent of brine and drying seaweed. Here, life follows the rhythm of the sea. Fishermen mending their boats by moonlight, nets stretched between posts to dry, and the steady thump of oars heading out with each new tide. In this world, every net is a lifeline. Too weak, and a catch is lost. Too brittle, and a family goes hungry. For generations, imported nets, expensive, impressive, boasting foreign strength, dominated the village markets. Yet beneath this commerce ran a quieter story, woven thread by a fisherwoman whose hands had learned the sea's secrets from childhood. From a young age, she followed her grandmother along the tide line, collecting driftwood and scraps of cord, learning to tie and untie the complicated knots used to repair old nets. The men on the beach worked with heavy rope, copying what they'd seen on ships or heard in market tales. But her grandmother taught her a knotting pattern almost forgotten, one that flexed with the pull of the tide instead of snapping or stretching thin. The trick was in the balance. Each knot locked itself tighter under strain, but loosened enough to be mended and reused, a small, clever solution learned in lean years when new rope was rare. As she grew older, the fisherwoman made her own nets from bundles of rough flax and sturdy twine, fingers flying through the repetition of the pattern, building each mesh with patience and care. The rhythm of her work became part of her life's music. The gentle slap of waves, the hiss of sand underfoot, the soft click of wooden needles against her calloused palms. At first, her nets were for family, lighter and easier to handle, yet tough enough to bring in a good catch. The women at the well whispered about how long her nets lasted, how quickly she could repair them, how little waste she left behind. But the men who ran the boats, who negotiated with traders in town, eyed her work with a mixture of curiosity and quiet skepticism. Imported goods were status symbols, proof of success and connection to distant ports. Local craft, especially by a woman, was dismissed as second best. Yet the seasons turned, and the imported nets began to fray. Mended once, then twice, then left tangled in the shed. One by one, men began to appear at her door, first shy, then eager, asking for nets to test, offering a little money or a share of the catch. She sold her nets quietly, at night or in the early hours when most of the village slept. Those who bought them would head to sea before dawn, returning with heavier boats and stories of fewer lost catches. Word traveled along the coast, but always with a wink and a lowered voice. The men who resold her nets at market claimed they were foreign, brought in from distant cities or even from overseas. No one questioned it. After all, Who would believe that the best nets were knotted by a local woman in a salt-worn cottage near the dunes? The rhythm of her days remained steady. Each morning, she checked her supplies, stretched new cords, and listened for the sound of footsteps on the path. She tended her small patch of garden, mended sails for neighbors, and kept her secrets close. Even as demand grew, she kept to her quiet routine, never boasting, never seeking credit. In time, the foreign nets faded from memory, and the strength of her work became something of a quiet legend. Men who had once doubted her skill now relied on her craft, though few would ever speak her name in public. Imagine the marketplace in late summer, filled with the shouts of traders and the laughter of children darting between baskets of fish. Merchants hold up their goods, nets with fine, even knots, strong enough to impress even the most skeptical buyer. In the crowd, a fisherman fingers the mesh, recognizing the twist of a childhood knot, the invisible signature of the hands that made it. He smiles to himself, says nothing, and moves on, knowing that strength can be hidden, that the sea rewards the quiet and the clever. If you ever find yourself by such a shore, look for the nets that outlast the storms, that flex and hold, mended and reused again and again. In their threads, you may feel the rhythm of a life spent learning the wisdom of the tides. A story woven into the heart of the village, strong enough to outlast even the salt and wind. The Bellfounder's wife who tuned cathedral bells by ear. Imagine yourself in a medieval city at dawn, as a pale mist clings to the rooftops and the first bells begin to sound. The air is cool, faintly metallic with the scent of forged smoke and morning dew. At the center of town, a cathedral rises, its bell tower reaching into the low sky. The ringing that spills from those heights is pure and resonant, carrying far over fields and rivers, marking hours and summoning worshippers. Few ever wondered who made those bells sing so true. The craft of the Bellfounder was considered mysterious and almost sacred, a trade of fire and molten bronze, of careful measurement and secrets passed down through generations. Yet there was a chapter of this story hidden from view, a chapter written not in guild records or church annals, but in the quiet footsteps of a woman who climbed the spiral stairs when no one was watching. Her husband had long been known for his skill. He measured alloy, watched the casting, and supervised the finishing with expert hands. But as the years went on, his hearing grew clouded, dulled by age and the very noise of the furnaces that made his name. At first, only those closest to the family noticed how he frowned and leaned close when the bells were rung, how he hesitated before pronouncing a new casting perfect. It was his wife who quietly stepped in, adapting her life to the rhythms and necessities of his work. In the beginning, she listened as he had once listened, standing beside him in the bell tower or at the foundry yard, ears alert for the subtle difference between a bell's true voice and a flaw hidden deep within its bronze. Over time, she learned the difference between a tone that rang full and clear and one with a troublesome shadow, too flat, too sharp, or muddied by a silent crack. She practiced in secret, testing her memory by striking bowls, water jugs, and scrap metal, comparing their voices to those that echoed from the cathedral tower. The Bellfounder's wife, unnoticed, was learning to tune bells by ear. When her husband could no longer trust his own judgment, she began to climb the narrow stairs herself, lantern in hand, her skirt brushing against cold stone. Up in the tower, she would strike the newly hung bell with a wooden mallet, listening as the sound spiraled outward, filling the vaulted space. She learned to sense when a note was just shy of true, when a bell's voice seemed to tremble with something unresolved. In these moments, she would descend and quietly suggest changes. A little more metal shaved from the inner lip, a new angle in the clapper's swing, a subtle change in how the bell was braced against the beam. The laborers in the foundry quickly realized her ear was impeccable. They began to wait for her approval before calling a bell finished, trusting her calm nod or gentle frown more than the official verdict. Word spread among those who worked close to the fires. but never reached the cathedral priests or the town elders. To the wider world, the Bellfounder's name, her husband's name, remained attached to every triumph. Her adjustments changed the sound of the city. In time, churches from distant towns sent for bells from this foundry, requesting that special clear resonance they had heard on a traveler's visit. They never knew it was her touch, her careful listening at dawn and dusk, that set their bells apart. When her husband's hands finally trembled too much for the work, it was she who trained his apprentice, quietly demonstrating how to listen, how to tune, how to trust what the ear revealed. Yet even then, her name appeared in no account book or record. Just as it had not when she made her first climb up the winding stairs. Imagine the hush of the bell tower in early morning, the city still half asleep below, as she stands beside a great bronze bell, one hand resting on its cool, curved side. She taps the bell, lets its voice bloom, and listens, not just with her ear, but with her whole self, attuned to every nuance and harmonic. And as the city wakes to the flawless song of the bells, she slips back down the steps, blending into the quiet rhythm of daily life. Her role unmarked, but her legacy ringing on. So next time you hear the perfect clarity of a cathedral bell, consider the hidden stories behind its tone. Imagine the woman who tuned it by ear, her name lost to history, and let the echoes remind you that not every legacy is written in stone. Some are carried in sound, lasting long after the listener is gone. The Dyer who created colors that only appeared in Moonlight. Imagine yourself walking through the winding streets of a medieval town at dusk, where the day's commotion fades into the steady hush of evening. Lanterns flicker in windows, and shopkeepers sweep dust from doorsteps as the last merchants pack away their goods. Among the many trades that animate the town, smiths, bakers, carpenters, and weavers, there is a small, unassuming workshop near the river, its air always tinged with a bittersweet scent of boiling herbs and crushed minerals. This is the home of a Dyer, known more for her quiet diligence than for any claim of mastery. By daylight, she is much like any other artisan. Sleeves rolled, hands stained, stirring her steaming cauldrons with practiced care. Bales of linen and silk hang drying from beams, and neighbors come and go with orders for simple garments, altar cloths, or festival banners. But as the years pass, quiet rumors begin to drift through the town. Her fabrics are said to change their colors in the hush of night, revealing hidden hues and secret patterns under the gentle gaze of the moon. Imagine a noble woman arriving at the dyer's door, drawn by word of mouth rather than proclamation. She brings a bolt of silk, hoping for something uncommon, a color no one else can match. The Dyer welcomes her in, offers a simple cup of tea, and listens closely. There are no grand promises, no boastful claims, only the assurance that the work will be ready when the next full moon rises. Days go by, and the town returns to its rhythms. Few notice as the Dyer tends her vats at odd hours, sometimes well after sunset, adding mysterious powders and twisting bundles of cloth with deliberate, measured gestures. When the fabric is finally delivered, it appears unremarkable in the morning light. A soft blue, perhaps, or a shade of green like willow leaves. But when the night deepens and the moon's pale light touches the cloth, the color slowly transforms. Patterns bloom in silver or violet, the fabric shimmering faintly with every movement. Some colors become richer, others fade into ghostly outlines, enchanting those who see them and leaving rivals to wonder at the method. The effect is never loud or garish. It is a quiet, subtle magic, noticed most often in the solitude of gardens or the silent corridors of old stone halls. Under torchlight or sun, the garments remain calm, their secret held close. But beneath the moon and stars, they awaken, soft, luminous, changing as clouds drift and shadows move across the sky. Noble women begin to favor the Dyer's work for night festivals, moonlit dances, and secret gatherings. Her reputation grows, and soon, even distant courtiers send word, requesting her elusive craft. Competitors try to imitate the effect, but without success. They watch from afar, speculate in taverns, and search for clues in the ashes discarded behind her shop. Some say she uses rare flowers gathered only at midnight. Others claim the river water holds strange minerals, or that the dyes are mixed with powder ground from crystals found in ancient ruins. No one ever discovers the truth. Imagine the dyer, standing alone by the riverbank on a clear night, gathering leaves by moonlight or rinsing newly dyed cloth in the cold water. The only witness is her daughter, a quiet companion who helps with the chores and asks careful questions. Over the years, the dyer passes on her knowledge not through books or public lectures, but through small, steady acts, showing the precise moment to lift the cloth from the vat, the right words to whisper, the signs that a color is ready or must be left to rest until dawn. The secret becomes a kind of inheritance, not simply a formula, but a relationship with a natural world. Learning how plants and stones and water respond to the cycles of light and darkness. The method is never written down, but embedded in the gentle repetition of days and the silent language between mother and daughter. For outsiders, the enchantment of the moonlit colors remains unsolved, a curiosity to admire but never possess. Some suggest the dyer is favored by saints or blessed by the old spirits of the river. Others quietly resent her success, uneasy at the thought that something so beautiful can be kept beyond the reach of rules and guild charters. In time, as new dyes and fashions sweep through the region, the dyer's little shop remains much the same. The walls darken with the stains of 1,000 experiments, and the air remains thick with the scent of roots, blossoms, and burning wood. The daughter grows into her own role, carrying the secret in her hands and her memory, greeting customers with the same quiet hospitality as her mother once did. Imagine yourself, many years later, standing before a garment dyed in this way. The room is dark, save for a single window open to the stars. As the moonlight washes over the fabric, it shimmers with an unearthly glow, shifting in hue and revealing patterns that seem almost to breathe. You trace the edge of the cloth with your fingers, feeling the softness and wondering at the hidden labor. How many nights spent in patience, how many careful choices made in silence. And so the legend endures, a gentle mystery woven into the fabric of the town itself. The colors that come alive by moonlight are more than a trick or a secret. They are the quiet testament of a woman's craft, her perseverance, and her trust that some knowledge is best passed not in words, but from one careful hand to another, under the watchful gaze of the night sky. The shipwright's sister who reinforced hulls without credit. Imagine yourself in a fog-laden dawn at a bustling medieval shipyard, the salt tang of the sea mingling with the acrid smell of pitch and wet timber. Shipwrights move with quiet urgency around the skeleton of a new vessel, the air filled with the tap and rasp of tools, shouts of foremen, and the steady thud of axes into beams. In this male-dominated world, you might overlook the young woman who moves between stacks of planks, sleeves rolled high, hair covered by a stained kerchief, her hands deft and sure as she slips through the shadows of the half-built hull. Most know her simply as the shipwright's sister, a helper, nothing more. Yet when the workday wanes, and the eyes of masters and apprentices are elsewhere, it is she who lingers within the ribs of the unfinished ship, quietly seeking out every weakness that might later spell disaster at sea. Official records from the dockyard mention her brother by name, always credited for the sturdy ships that left their port. His skill is real, but his reputation is made possible by her hidden labor. She knows that a hull is only as strong as its quietest joint, only as seaworthy as the wood others might miss or dismiss. When daylight fades and most workers head to alehouses or home, she returns to the silent hulls with her small bundle of tools, a wedge-shaped chisel, scraps of linen, and a mixture of pine tar and resin she prepared herself. Her repairs are precise. A swelling knot here, a splintering edge there, a warped seam where salt could creep in. She patches, braces, and caulks, her work invisible beneath fresh planks or the thick, protective skin of pitch. She never signs her repairs, and even the few who suspect her skill look the other way. Custom and guild law allow no official place for women's hands on the great ships that bear the city's seal. Her tools are hidden in a barrel near the waterline, wrapped in sacking to keep them from view. In the evenings, she may be glimpsed slipping away along the dock, her apron streaked with tar, her eyes scanning the hulls for spots others have missed. Imagine her attention to detail. The way she listens to the sound each plank makes under her fist. The way she smells for the faint whiff of rot that spells future danger. The Shipwright's sister takes pride in work that is measured not in praise, but in survival. When a storm howls and waves batter the decks, it is her hands that keep the water at bay, though no captain ever knows it. Sometimes she slips small marks into her repairs. A knot tied a certain way, or a strip of linen with a pattern she alone recognizes. These are not signatures but private proofs, evidence that she was there, and that the vessel's safety was as much her doing as her brother's. When a ship survives a gale, or limps home after a hard voyage, the master shipwright is called to the docks for praise and reward. He nods gravely, accepts coin or ale, and sometimes glances down the quay to where his sister works quietly at the next hull. Between them, there is an understanding, unspoken but binding. Imagine the culture of the shipyard, the camaraderie and rivalries, the steady pressure to produce ships that are not only swift and handsome, but safe. Accidents and losses at sea are never blamed on the hull's secret faults. Blame falls on storms, on fate, on the captain's judgment. Only those who survive remember, and among the shipbuilders, only a handful ever whisper that the real strength of the ship comes from work done in silence and shadow. The shipwright's sister learns to find satisfaction in the rhythm of her labor. The smell of pine tar, the resistance of seasoned wood under her chisel, the hush that falls as she checks her work by lantern light. When she hears that a ship she helped repair has returned safely after a violent storm, she feels a private swell of pride. She has no need for applause or reward. Her work is its own assurance, her legacy built into every watertight seam. Years pass, her brother's reputation grows, and the dockside stories turn his name into legend. No one writes of her work, but sometimes a sailor, running his hand over a joint during a refit, will find a knot or linen wrap he does not recognize. He may wonder, briefly, about the unknown hand that strengthened the ship against the sea. Then he moves on, never knowing the true story. Centuries later, when maritime historians study the construction of ships that survived impossible storms, they remark on the unusual care in the joinery and patchwork, the subtle reinforcements that set these vessels apart. They puzzle over certain patterns, repairs that seem the work of a single meticulous hand. Yet no logbook, no inscription reveals her name. So the shipwright's sister endures in silence, her presence woven into the planks and beams of ships that bore others to distant shores. When you walk the quiet docks at dusk and see the silhouette of a woman moving with purpose, tools hidden in her apron, remember her story. The invisible labor that saved countless lives, sealed forever beneath pitch and salt, known only to the sea and the hands that shaped it. The horologist who repaired town clocks without guild entry. Imagine a town wrapped in the soft shadows of evening, where lanterns flicker in the narrow streets, and the only sound, hour by hour, is the uncertain voice of the town clock echoing from above. In this place, time itself sometimes seemed to wander. Bells striking at the wrong hour, gears grinding and sticking, townsfolk glancing up in confusion as the tower's hands spun too fast or too slow. Clocks were the heartbeats of these towns, but like all things made by hands, they faltered, fell silent, or slipped out of rhythm. In such a town, there lived a woman whose talent was not acknowledged by any guild, whose name never appeared in the rosters of official craftsmen. She was the daughter of a watchmaker, raised among tiny gears and the hush of careful work. As a girl, She learned to listen for the soft tick of a well-tuned mechanism, to coax time itself back into order with a turn of her fingers. Yet, in a world ruled by guilds, the doors to official apprenticeships and recognized mastery remained closed to her. The guilds did not welcome women, nor did they trust any hand not stamped with their seal. Still, the woman watched the town's clock from afar. The great face set high in its tower, its hands heavy and slow, the chime that once called bakers to their ovens and children home from play. When the clock faltered, the townsfolk grumbled and waited for a traveling horologist to pass through, for the guild to send a distant expert. But often, no one came. The errors grew. Bells rang too soon for sunrise, or so late that dawn was already at the edge of the rooftops. Farmers missed the moment to lead their oxen out. Markets opened at odd hours, and weddings and funerals risked beginning at the wrong time. The rhythm of daily life, a rhythm so many took for granted, began to unravel. At dusk, the woman made her quiet preparations. She waited until the streets grew empty, until the hush of night pressed gently against every door and window. Then, with a set of tools wrapped in old cloth, she would slip through alleys and ascend the narrow stairs of the clock tower. Sometimes through a forgotten side door, sometimes with a silent blessing of a sympathetic caretaker who understood the cost of pride. Inside the tower, dust danced in the beams of her lantern. The machinery loomed overhead. Iron weights, ropes, great wooden gears stained with oil and age. She moved with careful purpose, listening to the creak and scrape, feeling the subtle thrum of tension in each spring. She measured the beat of the pendulum, counted each tooth along a gear, and watched the wheels turn in patient circles. Sometimes, her only company was the flutter of bats, or the distant sigh of wind through a cracked window. She worked with a gentle touch, adjusting misaligned cogs, resetting the tension, coaxing ancient gears back into harmony. She brought with her a bag of spare parts, bits and pieces scavenged from old clocks and discarded trinkets, shaping them to fit where the originals had worn thin. Hours passed in the stillness, marked only by the slow tick of the tower's heart, growing surer and steadier beneath her hands. By morning, she was gone. The townsfolk woke to the clear, confident chime of the hour. They checked the sky and found, to their relief, that the clock now agreed with the sun and the rhythm of their days. The mayor, never seeing who had come or gone, called it a miracle, whispering to the council that perhaps the town had finally found favor again. But the horologist kept her secret. She returned home with hands dusted in grease and a heart quietly full, content that her work spoke where her name could not. Some nights, she returned to repeat her hidden task. The clock, after all, was stubborn, and years of neglect had left it with quirks only she seemed able to soothe. In time, a few observant townsfolk noticed her presence. A candle flickering in the tower at odd hours, the faint sound of tools echoing through the empty stairwell. A caretaker left her apples and bread on the landing, never asking questions. A child glimpsed her shadow against the gears, and later whispered stories of a clock spirit, a gentle ghost who kept time safe for everyone. The guild never knew. If the town sent for help, it came late and found no fault to fix. The mayor would shrug, and life would continue. Markets opening with the sun, bells calling worshippers at the right hour, bakers and children trusting the clock once more. In quiet moments, the woman sometimes visited the square, standing beneath the tower as the bells rang out, lost in the sound that now matched her heartbeat. Years later, when the clock's workings were studied or repaired by others, they found strange, clever fixes. Gears from foreign watches, wires wound in novel ways, tiny signatures hidden where no one but another horologist would see. Even then, few understood that the miracle was not luck, but the quiet persistence of a woman denied a title, yet determined that her skill would keep the town's heart steady. The rhythm of her nights shaped the days of everyone she never met, a secret craft woven into the fabric of ordinary time. So if you ever pass a town where the bells strike just right and the hands never falter, imagine the silent work that keeps the hours true. The gentle patience of someone who loved the machinery of time enough to mend it, even if no one would ever say her name aloud. The quarry worker's daughter who predicted stone breaks by sound, ChatGPT said. Imagine yourself in a valley where dawn spills pale gold across the face of a working quarry, its sides layered in bands of chalk and granite, ringing faintly with the sounds of chisels and low, steady conversation. The air here is cool and always a little sharp with the dust of stone. Workers move in practiced patterns, hauling ropes, wheeling carts, and calling to each other over the clang of tools. Among them, a young girl, daughter of a veteran quarryman, moves with quiet purpose, holding not a hammer, but a slender wooden dowel and a small iron chisel worn smooth by years of use. The men of the quarry were taught to trust the weight of their bodies and the swing of their arms, reading the rock by sight and feel. They watched for veins and faults, for the subtle color changes that meant a block would split cleanly or shatter unpredictably. Yet, even among these practiced hands, accidents happened. A misjudged swing or a missed crack could send a sheet of stone tumbling without warning, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes not. For as long as anyone could remember, the work had been dangerous, part art, part guesswork, and always demanding of courage. From the time she could walk, the quarry worker's daughter watched her father tap the stones before each cut. He showed her how every block had its own language, a resonance that could be coaxed out with the right touch. A gentle tap would send a note humming through the earth, a deep, full tone for a strong stone, a higher, hollow sound when a fracture lurked just beneath the surface. Most men listened for noise, for the confirmation of their expectations. But the daughter learned to listen for difference. A sudden drop in pitch, a faint rattle, the hush between two notes. In the quiet of early mornings, when the quarry was empty but for the wind, she practiced, marking which stones rang true and which ones whispered of weakness. Her skill grew in the shadows of daily life, often unnoticed, sometimes quietly dismissed. She was quick to point out stones that sounded wrong, and her father, patient and a little proud, would sometimes heed her warnings, redirecting the day's labor to a different face, marking a suspect block for careful extraction. Some of the older quarrymen laughed at her caution, attributing safe breaks to luck and any misstep to her inexperience. Still, the habit took root. Before a risky cut, more and more workers asked her to tap the stone, just in case. One late summer afternoon, when the sun hung low and the heat pressed down, a deep fissure appeared along the quarry's south wall. The men prepared to clear it, eyeing the seam and estimating how the stone would fall. The girl was called to the edge, her dowel and chisel in hand. She listened, tapping softly, and called for everyone to stand back, sensing a hollow behind the outer layer. Moments later, with only the gentlest nudge from a crowbar, the section slid down in a single sheet, dust billowing, but no one harmed, no tools lost, the stone broken cleanly and safely. Those watching exchanged glances, uneasy at the correctness of her signal, then quickly credited fortune, not skill. Afterwards, the pattern continued. She was asked to tap and listen, especially when the stone looked tricky or when recent rains made the layers unpredictable. Sometimes she was ignored, and the work proceeded with the usual risks. Yet, more often than not, those who listened to her advice finished their days with fewer mishaps, fewer near misses, and more intact stone to show for their labor. Even so, her gift was rarely named as such. The men said she brought luck, or that she had a light touch. They told stories of the quarry's whisper, as if the stone itself chose when to break and whom to warn. The rhythm of her days remained steady, rising early to the sound of doves in the hedgerows, sharing a hasty meal of bread and cheese, and slipping into the quarry as the first shadows stretched across the walls. She watched the workers, learned the names of the stones, and added her voice to the daily calls for caution. The village saw her as an oddity, part of the landscape, neither fully child nor fully grown, both respected and a little dismissed. Her reputation as a bearer of luck persisted, told in stories at the tavern, repeated to outsiders, but seldom written down or credited with intention. As years passed, the quarry's fortunes rose and fell. New workers arrived. Old ones retired or left for work elsewhere. The daughter remained, her ear for stone becoming legend among those who paid attention. In the evenings, she would sit on the edge of the quarry, feet dangling over the slope, and listen to the hush that settled after the last echo of hammers faded. She knew each note, each whisper, each fracture that lay hidden beneath the surface. If you ever find yourself in a place where stone is split from earth, pause and listen. The sound may seem ordinary at first, a simple ring or dull thud. But somewhere, there's always someone listening for what's hidden. Someone whose careful patience turns danger into safety and guesswork into skill. The difference, often, is as subtle as a change in tone. Rarely noticed, rarely named, yet woven into the fabric of work and memory, outlasting even the strongest stone.